I want to tell you about Durrell. He was an icon of nature conservation in the 20th century. And his message was that there is infinite value in biodiversity and that it behoves all of us to do our utmost to save it. Jerry left a legacy as a communicator. He wrote as many books as Shakespeare did plays, and I know that you all know that's 37. He scripted and presented numerous radio and television shows about animals and conservation. Now, the key to Jerry's popularity, I think, was his delight in discovering the natural world and the animals and plants that live in it. He gets people to reconnect with animals and to get excited about that connection on both an emotional and an intellectual level. A reader of Durrell's books rediscovers the link that binds us all together as living beings and begins to understand how our own species fits into the natural scheme of things. Now, there's an added explanation for Jerry's popularity, and that's his ability to make his readers laugh, be happy, and feel good. And I think, as we heard earlier, that's an important component here. Our patron, Princess Anne, tells the story that when she read her first Durrell book, she was sitting on a train and she laughed out loud and made people stare at her. Jerry certainly instinctively knew the value of making positive statements. And yet, he could hurl fire and brimstone like an Old Testament prophet when it came to attributing blame for the decline of biodiversity, which he recognized earlier than most people. There's that famous passage from his book about a trip to Sierra Leone in the mid-60s, and it goes like this: "The world is as delicate and as complicated as a spider's web. If you touch one thread, you send shudders running through all the other threads. We're not just touching the web, we are tearing great holes in it." It was Jerry's passion for the natural world and his witness to its decline that galvanized him to action. And it's this action for which he also earned iconic status and which also became his lasting legacy. Half a century ago, he established what's now called the Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. He guided the evolution of its conservation strategy by following one very simple principle, which was reflected in his writings. He said, "Start with the animal and all else follows." Today we would call it the credo of species conservation. These are just a few of the species that we've pulled back from the brink of extinction, and I'd like to tell you our story very briefly and then hand you over to my colleague, Professor John Farr, Durrell's Director of Conservation Science, for some thoughts on strategy and the future for species conservation. Well, Jerry discovered his passion for wildlife when he was a child, particularly during the years he spent in the island of Corfu. He wrote about these years in a now classic of English literature, My Family and Other Animals, which was a set book in schools and clearly had a great influence on a whole generation of readers. As a young man, Jerry collected wild animals to sell to zoos, but he became thoroughly disillusioned with the zoos of the day, whose attitude was there are always more where they came from. Jerry had seen it firsthand. This was certainly not the case, as habitat loss and overexploitation began to take a toll on wildlife all over the world. So Jerry decided to set up a zoo of his own, a zoo with a difference, one that would be devoted to saving animals from extinction by breeding them and one day releasing them back to the wild when it was safe to do so. He eventually settled in Jersey in 1959, and in 1963 he turned his little zoo into a charitable trust, using the extinct dodo of Mauritius as its emblem. Now, our first task was breeding, of course, and that we did with increasing success. Jerry had a penchant for small, more obscure species, those that the conventional zoos weren't interested in. He called these the little brown jobs. We excelled in their husbandry and breeding and began studying them in the wild and disseminating our knowledge. Jerry also had a penchant for island fauna, not least because the dodo had come from an island. Mauritius was like a magnet to Jerry, and although it was too late for the dodo, we took up the causes of other Mauritian birds in the nick of time. The Mauritian kestrel, the pink pigeon, and the echo parakeet. The little islet off the coast of Mauritius called Round Island became another of our early cause célèbre. Round Island had become a refuge for mascarene endemics, but itself was threatened by exotic grazers, goats and rabbits. We removed this livestock and then tried to control invasive plants in our first effort at habitat restoration. And although the work is still very much ongoing, we can safely say that we have saved a number of species from extinction. West across the sea is another island, a rather big one, Madagascar. Continental island and vastly larger than Mauritius, but demonstrating the same principle that islands are crucibles of evolution and major contributors to global biodiversity. Our conservation effort in Madagascar has grown into our biggest program, and we work with many threatened species there, such as the Alautran gentle lemur, found only in the marshes surrounding Madagascar's largest lake, which are being cleared for rice production. The Madagascar giant jumping rat, this is one of my favorites, now confined to a small patch of dry forest in the west, and the Madagascar side-necked turtle, for which we have done breeding and release. In the neighboring Comora Islands, we're partnering with Bristol Zoo on a community watershed conservation program, but this grew out of our work with this species, the Livingston's fruit bat, which is an incredibly important species ecologically as it's a seed disperser for the native forests. We've recently added the Galapagos Islands to our portfolio for the critically endangered mangrove finch, for which we've done successful translocations, and the Floriana mockingbird, which is known for being the species that made the penny drop for Charles Darwin. We've worked in the Caribbean for a number of years, starting with the St. Lucia parrot and moving on to various species of iguana, such as this impressive blue iguana from Grand Cayman, and a critically endangered amphibian from Montserrat known as the mountain chicken. In the Dominican Republic, we've set our sights on a fabulous creature. It was one of Jerry's favorites, an insectivore called the Solenodon, and fondly known to our staff at Durrell as the Celine Dion. Now, that's my whirlwind account of Jerry and the history of the Trust, and now I'd like to hand over to John Farr. Thank you.